Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted. Yeah, was having trouble finding a job, and that I wanted to make a career,
Hmm.
and mainly because I had a high draft number. So
Hmm.
I kept thinking that I may as well get it over with, and ended up in the Army Security Agency.
How old were you when you joined?
22, I think, just 21. Ooh, yeah. We left here on a and went to Omaha, and they swore us in and put us on a train to Fort Leonard Wood, where I spent basic training.
Tell me about your boot camp training experience.
Boot camp was it was in the middle of winter, and cold and blustery and rainy and sleet, and not a lot of fun. Learn all the basics of how to use your weapon, and some basic infantry moves and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, like I said, it was cold and miserable. One of my favorite memories is being on a rifle range one day, and not being where we could get back to the mess hall for lunch. They brought us fried chicken, which and we were out there when our coats and hats and gloves, and trying to eat raw or cooked chicken with gloves on.
How did you get through it?
Well, you just kept going from one day to the next, and I was lucky enough to get through without getting recycled. But that time of year, there are quite a few guys who come down with a cold or the flu or whatever just from being in the cold all day long. I was in the Army Security Agency, and we were monitoring uh, telephone calls and radio calls, and even down to watching the East German side of the fence, their television programs, and uh, any way we could collect information that might be useful.
What did they teach you in the service?
Well, they taught me how to run a teletype machine, and tape recorders, and radios, lots of radios.
Where did you serve?
In Berlin, General tour overseas was in Berlin. I was in the 78th USASA Special Operations Unit. And nowadays, when you say Special Operations Unit, you see guys in camo and carrying full automatic weapons, got the camo paint on their faces. We were quite a bit different type of a Special Operations Unit. We were running radios and trying to stay out of the limelight as much as we could.
Did you serve during a war?
No, it was Cold War time, and the wall had just gone up in East Germany, in East Berlin, across East Berlin, I guess I should say. And things were a little hot occasionally. I have some pictures that show how stark it was over on that side, and it was not a real fun time.
Tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
Well, probably the most memorable thing was that Berlin was a place where your wives could come and join you, and we lived off post, and our first child was born in Berlin. One of the funnier things that happened was one of the sites we had was probably a few hundred yards from the wall, and there were guard towers about every quarter of a mile. And we sitting there having lunch and kind of bored, waiting for our shift to start again, and we decided we'd see what we could get any reaction out of those guys in the guard towers across the fence. And we got an old stovepipe and a Coke bottle, and we wrapped it in something white silver, so like tinfoil, I think it was. And we went out and we got up on the roof of the building we were in, and we pointed that thing at one of them and dropped that Coke bottle wrapped in silver like it was gonna be a mortar. And of course, nothing happened. And we thought we might get some kind of a reaction out of the guy in the tower, but you couldn't see, couldn't see anything. He must have thought we were nuts.
That was dangerous.
Yeah, it could have been dangerous. Yeah, I suppose if he'd have got excited and shot at us, we might have regretted that. No, well, I have some medals on my thing, but they were pretty much automatic. They were Army of Expedition medal that if you served in Europe or in the Army during that time, everybody got one. Then I have a medal that I'm a little bit proud of. It was Army of Occupation from the Second World War, and this is 1962, you know, that. And then I got a good conduct medal for minding my P's and Q's, I guess you might say.
How did you get promoted?
Mostly time and grade. When I got there, I was a PFC, and once the time ran out, why we moved to Spec 4, and then after a certain length of time, your sergeant recommended you got to put up for what we call Spec 5, which is, you see the patch, it's got a gold bar stripe over the top. Shortly after that, I rotated out of Berlin. That was, highest rank was Spec 5, which is Specialist 5th class, if you want to talk it in plain English.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Mostly by letter. I never tried calling from there because I didn't know whether we could do it or not. But mostly it was letters. I've got a box full of letters I found the other day when I was looking for stuff that I sent home to my wife and to my folks until my wife came over.
How often did you send them letters?
Oh, probably once a week to my wife, and then maybe once or twice a month to my folks. Typical Army. Talking about the food reminds me that one of my assignments was at Tempelhof Air Force Base, which is actually the city's one of their main airports in Berlin. Tempelhof is probably famous for the fact that during the war they had an airplane plant underneath, and I think that's probably why the Air Force got control of the site. But we would. At lunchtime, they allowed us to go down to their mess hall, and they actually used real plates and cups and sauce. Didn't have tin plates with dividers in them. That was quite an experience. Had really good German cooks, and we enjoyed that a lot. With the wall being there, it was a little stressful. At times, the East German Army would stop convoys. Of course, being 110 miles inside East Germany, the supplies had to come down the Autobahn, and occasionally they would stop them, especially if it was a bunch of troops that had been on maneuvers in the West and they came back. They would stop them. They held them out there 2 or 3 days usually. Things get a little exciting, and pretty soon the diplomats would get it all straightened out and they'd come home. I don't think I did anything special for good luck.
How did people entertain themselves?
Oh, we had a movie on post, and then the main PX was over in another part of town, and they had a bigger movie theater. They usually had 2 things going at once. So mostly movies, and then Berlin's a very interesting city. There's a lot of things to see. My wife and I would take off on a weekend and go look at whatever we could find. There were museums and all kinds of war memorials sitting around the city that were interesting to look at, tried to read about. There was a big tower that looked kind of like the Eiffel Tower in Paris, called the Rundfunk, and from the top of that you could see a long ways around the city. It was interesting to see. I was very happy to leave there, but we had to, having had my wife on there, we had to get all of our household goods put together and in a special trunk that was, would take the sea trip, because it all came by surface. And packed all that stuff up, and of course we had to do that a little bit ahead of time because it took a while to get that all authorized. Then I had to move back into barracks for a couple of weeks and I had forgotten what that was like, and it was when you're around about 50 guys in a bay, why it's kind of
Mhm.
interesting.
Did you go anywhere on leave?
Yeah, well, Berlin was a tough place to get in and out of, and I had a top secret security clearance, and they wouldn't let us travel by car down the Autobahn, and I couldn't afford a plane ticket, so the only way out was by what they called the duty train, which went from Berlin down to Frankfurt, and that usually didn't start until 10 o'clock at night because the East Germans didn't want us to see what was going on in their country. We had to cross 110 miles of it, so they were pretty particular about letting people go through there. So we went at night, and left at 10 o'clock at night from Berlin, got to Frankfurt at about 8 o'clock in the morning, so that pretty much shot one day of our pass. And then getting back in was exactly the same way. It was not an easy place to get in and out of. I guess a special event would be when Kennedy came to Berlin. There was quite a big to-do about that. There were so many people that we couldn't even get close to the square where he was speaking, so we went home and listened to it on the radio. I think everybody has special buddies that they make in the service, and I have some pictures of some guys that were in my unit in basic training. We stayed friends for quite a while.
Do you still have contact with your friends?
Yeah, Christmas time, usually we get a Christmas card, and then there was a couple from Minnesota that we met in Berlin, that he and his wife were living on the economy too, and well, that means we were living out, we didn't have housing on base, so we lived out among the Germans, and for some reason they called that the economy.
Mm-hmm. Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I didn't really,
Okay.
other than the pictures I've got. Yeah, that was a good day. Getting there from Berlin, we had to take the train again, of course, to get out of there.
Yeah.
And took a train all the way to Bremerhaven, got on a ship. I've got in my collection of stuff here, I've got a newspaper that the ship put out just about every day. They must have had somebody that needed something to do, and they put out this little newspaper. And in it had a map that showed how far we were across the North Atlantic. And this was in November, and North Atlantic is a little rough at times out there. There were several days we couldn't get across, couldn't go out on the front deck, and then a couple days later we couldn't go out on the back deck even. Water was coming over the sides so fast. They were afraid somebody would get washed over, I guess. I had a friend that left Berlin the same day I did. It's from my unit that the first day we got on the ship, I don't think we even had moved yet, and he was seasick almost instantly. And I think the whole 9 days that it took to get across the ocean, he was in his bunk. We'd cabbage some food out of the mess hall and bring it to him. So he could at least stay alive. When I got back home, we looked for a place to live, and then my dad had a service station here in Aurora, and I worked for him for a while. And a few years later, we joined a partnership. And as time went on, Dad decided he wanted to do something different. He'd been in the service station business for 40 years at that point, and he decided he wanted a job that didn't have to go outside all the time for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think I could afford to buy the business from him. Probably could have, but at that point, the money that was involved sounded like it'd take me a lifetime to pay off, but that turned out not to be true.
Mm-hmm.
But I had some friends that I met at a technical school I went to before, and one of them came through the station and said, I asked him what he was doing now. He said he worked for IBM. And that sounded intriguing. Next time I saw him, I asked him, at that point, I knew I was probably wanting to get out of that station. Next time I saw him, I asked him if they ever hired other people, take on new people. And he said, yeah, I'll let you know when that happens. Another couple of weeks later, he said, you still interested? And I said, you bet. And so I ended up working for IBM for 30-some years.
Did you take any college classes while you were in the service?
I didn't, and I've kicked myself now for not. The University of Maryland had a program that you could take correspondence courses. I had had a year and a half of college before I went in, and then I had 2 years of technical training at a trade school, and I could have probably got a degree by taking courses, but when you're only 22, 23 years old, you don't think that far ahead. No, the unit I was in was pretty secretive. There weren't a lot of us, although I'm finding out now when I read the Legion magazine, there were several other units just like ours all around the world. But I've never seen but one time that they were having a reunion, and I can't remember. It was someplace I couldn't get to that quick.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
I would say, yeah. Of course, I had two uncles that were in World War II. They influenced me probably that it was important to serve, to protect your country if you needed to. Even though I wasn't in a hot war, I felt like we were doing pretty good stuff. The information we gathered was critical at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really interesting place to get it from. Golly, that's a hard one to answer. That one about the playing like a martyr is a funny one, but there were serious times. On the midnight to 8 o'clock tricks, there were a lot of things you talked about. You made some pretty good friends. Things were pretty quiet at that time of day, and we played cards a lot. You learned a lot about your friends. I really enjoyed those guys. I'm sorry we didn't get to see each other more afterwards, but as far as feeling like I guess I feel like the military is a pretty valuable thing to have around, and you need good people to do it.